Hi everyone, William here with the Grand Duke Dmitri 1917 Diary Series, and today we're going to finish up with the long entry of the 23rd of September. So I should note, since it's relevant to the text we're doing today, that Dmitri was keeping a parallel journal alongside this one, in which he was writing about his explorations of New Thought philosophy, of self-improvement, and filling page after page with those. They're very interesting, but a lot of them are also long quotes of texts and things like that. Really a working journal, mantras that he could say every day. Yeah, fascinating, but I probably won't be doing those because it would be, long passages from various books and that sort of thing. So anyway, he will talk about those in his regular diary entries as he does today. All right, so what is our recap? Well, in the previous section of text, we had him worried, well, not really worried, but having a bit of a crisis of conscience about accommodations, because the time had come for the British and Russian diplomatic personnel to move from their summer residences in the foothills of the Elborz Mountains to Tehran, back to Tehran. And the Marlings had invited Dmitri to live with them in Tehran, but he knew he shouldn't because of, he was an active duty Russian officer, and he shouldn't be living at the British legation, especially not when there was a Russian legation. But he wasn't terribly welcome in the Russian legation or with other Russians, so he made the decision to stay on with the Marlings. Okay, that is the recap, and now let's dive into today's text. I want to start with a brief description of the details of my life, but my thoughts pull my pen in different directions, and I want to describe life and everyday activities a little more than I did in the last books, because then I was almost only talking about my thoughts and experiences. Of course, at the moment, these thoughts are the dominant fact of my existence. The clock itself, the unfolding of time, somehow recede into the background. One somehow lives so strangely now, somehow not fully. You cannot calmly allow your thoughts to go where they please. It's necessary to keep them in check, otherwise I would long ago have fallen into a black depression. It's good that I can now quite easily direct the flow of my thoughts, consciously preventing them from dwelling upon sad and soul-crushing matters. I repeat, if I could not do that, it would simply be unthinkable for me to live in the current situation. I must take into account that almost everything around me is full of suspense. For example, I don't know how long I will remain here in Persia, far from everyone, far from everything. Then there's my complete ignorance about what's happening at home. All this, of course, is an absolutely sufficient reason to fall into despair, if one should, only for an instant, allow oneself to think freely and seriously about it. The road to success helped me greatly, precisely in directing my thoughts. Only think success. Don't let your thoughts dwell on sadness, unhappiness, or poverty. Think happiness and success, and it will be yours. And that's the truth. I am attaching here an old group photograph taken in the courtyard of the Persian Cossack Division when I was leaving after my first visit to Tehran in April. Though almost 6 months have gone by since then, I talk about these people so often that it will later be pleasant to see their faces, albeit in a bad photograph. Okay, so I have not digitized that photograph yet. It came along with the microfilm copies of the diaries, and so once I've digitalized that, I will use it as a thumbnail picture or something like that. I'll put it up somehow. Okay, so quite melancholy. It made me think as I was going through it about how Dmitri, the second half of his life was defined really by exile, and this experience in 1917 of being in this limbo state, and not feeling like you're not really fully, as he puts it, not living fully, not fully connected to the things that you've always been connected to. And that was the experience, of course, of, millions of Russians after the revolution. I think it was something like, the estimate is between, I think, like 1 and 2 million who fled the country as refugees. But it was also Dmitri's experience at the end of his life when he went to Schatzalp in the midst of the Second World War, completely removed from family. His family, Maria and Audrey and Paul, everybody was in the U.S. Other family members in other parts of Europe, and you couldn't just, get in your car and drive across the border in those days. So that was another kind of exile where he couldn't say, will I be alive a year from now? And he was in suspense, he was in limbo, and unfortunately died under those same circumstances that had marked his life beginning in December 1916 after the Rasputin assassination. Okay, it breaks my heart to read this reference to the last books, and he's telling us that he filled them with his thoughts and experiments, and boy, I would just relish that. But those are lost, unfortunately. Those last books, meaning the first 4 of 1917, he wrote, this is book 5. So books 1 through 4 are lost. There are some letters that he wrote in January through April 1917. So, we do have some of his first hand account, but no diaries for that period. Anyway, you will remember, if you've been watching these all along, and particularly going back to 1906, 1907, what a poetic fellow Dmitri could be, that he liked he liked to express things rather poetically, at least intermittently. And here we have that coming through. It's when he's melancholy that he does that, It's when he's a little depressed that he does that. But here he is writing very elegantly about the clock, the unfolding of time. So that's a pretty good indication that he's depressed, but nice, it's nice when he does that. So the reference to Black Depression, that was a problem of his. That's not the only time that he uses this expression. And I get the impression, even in instances where he's not using that expression specifically, that it was an ongoing problem. I mean, he talks about it in a letter to Nicholas in 1914, and Nicholas talks about it in 1916. He talks about being worried about Dmitri because he's so clearly depressed. And, it probably was one of the factors that led to the Rasputin assassination. And so that goes along with what he's talking about here, which is I have to control my thoughts, or else I'm going to plunge into one of these depressions. And, he's putting it very starkly. It would simply be unthinkable for me to live in the current situation if there wasn't something preventing me from dwelling upon sad and soul-crushing matters. So, when he says it would be impossible for me to live, it would simply be unthinkable for me to live. Does he mean that he would, he would contemplate taking his own life? Well, according to Maria, he did write a suicide letter after the Rasputin assassination. But of course, we know that he didn't follow through with that, thank God. But it was serious to him, this idea of pushing these thoughts out of his head. And I always try to remember that rather than making value judgments. When I read about something like, him going out and participating in these paper chases and that sort of thing, or going to the theater after he found out that his father had died, and he remarks on that in 1919. People are criticizing me for this, but I just can't help it. It's how I'm coping. So anyway, you can make what you will of that. And then he turns to actually quoting it's a paraphrase of what he's learning from this book. So the book is The Road to Success. The author uses the pseudonym Hashnu Hara, but that very exotic sounding name to English speakers was actually a sham. It was, well, you'll see it in the thumbnail, William something or other, and he wrote all these books under several different pseudonyms about New Thought, which was a movement at that time, which basically we would call positive thinking, the power of positive thinking, which basically says you can change reality by directing your thoughts in a certain direction. Another book that Dmitri read along the same lines was called, what was it called? In Tune with the Infinite by Ralph Waldo Trine, and he also loved that book. And it wasn't just a passing thing because he was in crisis after the revolution. He would continue to be engaged with these books right up till the end of his life, and he'd have moments where he'd be sort of in despair about it and say, well, it just doesn't work. But then he'd go back to it again. So anyway, what does he say? Yes, only think success. Don't let your thoughts dwell on sadness, unhappiness, or poverty. Think happiness and success, and it will be yours. And that's the truth, he writes with an exclamation point. So this is how he's coping, specifically by not dwelling on sadness, unhappiness, or poverty, but thinking positive thoughts all the time. So if there seems to be a kind of disconnect in parts of the diary with the way he's describing his life and the reality of what's going on in the rest of the world and in Russia, then it's a conscious strategy on his part. Okay, so what do we have next time? Well, some interesting stuff next time. We'll have an incident with Dmitri shocking the Russian minister by something that he does. And we will have him making out with his hostess, Lady Marling, and talking about her and about that. So, even though it's not the most serious topic within the diaries, come back. And I hope to see you then. Bye.